In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, laudetur Jesus Christus.
In secula.
This is Timothy Flanders with the meaning of Catholic. Jesus is King. Welcome to the Terror of Demons morning show, together with co-host Kennedy Hall. Kennedy, how you doing, brother?
I'm living the dream.
Fantastic. What's the latest on the Canadian uprising? You guys free yet?
It's complicated. Yes and no. It's definitely had tons of effect. My province of Ontario and Quebec are probably the worst ones for politics in the country. We're like two massive blue states. Even though we have a conservative premier. So he did come out and say we're going to have all the measures scrapped by March 1st. No, March 31st. All the measures, which means probably the masks and, which I've never worn, but anyway, probably the masks and things like capacity restrictions, like the NHL stadium can only have 11,000 versus 18,000 because it's all very scientific. Like that, apparently, something is going to be in place till March 31st. But that the vaccine passports, or what there actually are, medical apartheid, that will be done very soon, apparently. Now, the thing is, they'll obviously say it has nothing to do with the truckers, right? But it's like all of a sudden they all decided to change their mind. The political science evolved, And however, I was just reading because today in Parliament, the Conservatives are forcing a vote on the federal mandates. Much like in America, there's sort of a federalist thing. So as much as I want to blame everything on Trudeau, he actually never enacted a single vaccine passport for a province. Nothing that technically has nothing to do with him. I mean, it's him because the fish rots from the head and he should go, but he never did it, right? Technically, the only things that he's done have been, like border stuff. And, in theory, if the premiers wanted to be sane, we would have a completely free country, except we wouldn't be able to leave or fly, which sounds unfree. But you could, my life in Ontario could be completely normal, even if he wanted to be crazy in his ways.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So, but the Conservatives have forced a vote. And that's happening today on the federal mandates. So for basically vaccine mandates for federal travel and stuff. Like I can't fly to see my sister in BC. I can't get on a boat. I could leave Canada technically. You could find a way. You'd have to drive and you'd have to have a special visa to get into the States, or you'd have to have permission. Although everyone's going to the border now and testing it, and they're not checking for passports going into the United States, like vaccine passports. Apparently, because the American security border guards obviously don't have access to your Canadian medical records, so they ask you for something like it's really just a formality, because it's like you could show them a cable bill. It's like, this is my proof of vaccination. That's what I've heard. And then people are now testing it, where they're coming back into Canada as citizens, and they get stopped by the border person. They're like, "Are you vaccinated?" And they're like, "No." Okay. Have you been tested? No. Did you sign any of the forms? No. And they're like, "I'm a Canadian citizen. The Constitution says you have to live back in the country." And then the border guards just kind of say, "Well, okay, well, make sure you go home and isolate." And they're like, "No." Just drive away. There's a video going viral. This girl did it, and they can't do it. So anyway, it's but apparently Trudeau was meeting today with all the premiers, all the first ministers of the provinces and the territories, with the potentiality of enacting the War Measures Act. And that's what so he wants to prove he's not Fidel Castro's son. So he wants to actually act like his Canadian father, who the last time the War Measures Act was enacted in Ontario, or in Canada, was during the FLQ, La Front de la Libération du Québec. It was basically like a Quebec terrorist organization. That was in the 1970s. They actually did kidnap and kill a politician. They got pretty insane. So they had the War Measures Act. So on campuses and stuff, you saw guys walking around with AK-47s and everything. It looked very Cuba-esque, pun intended. And so on the same day, Trudeau was calling an emergency meeting to meet with the premiers to probably enact the War Measures Act. But on the same time, there's a vote coming to scrap the mandates. Last thing I'll say about Canadian inside baseball here for politics. We have a minority parliament, and you can do this thing called a non-confidence vote, where the other parties basically say we have no confidence in you anymore, and you don't have a majority, so we're calling a new election. I think that's going to happen. I think today, if the vaccine mandates are not dropped federally from the vote, and if the War Measures Act is considered, I think that the parties will do a no confidence vote and we'll have an election within 2 months. That's what I think. And then I think the Conservatives, even though they're terrible in some ways, I think they'll win in a landslide because they'll jump on that freedom train because it's politically advantageous now. And we'll see. But all that's because of the truckers. Who knows?
All right. Well, yeah, we'll see. Go Truckers. Sweet.
Did the truckers win the Super Bowl last night too?
Yeah, the truckers won the Super Bowl last night. Oh boy.
Anyway, what's going on in Whitmertopia down there on the other side of the border?
Yeah, Whitmertopia, doing great. I just had COVID. It was pretty mild. Still have COVID fatigue and all that fun stuff. But yeah, things are good. Got through it without any vaccination or whatever. I just
that's not possible. You're lying.
I popped the pills, did some supplements, kept my immune system up, and it was like a 2-day thing. And that was it. So that was my first time with COVID. So,
well, I'm glad we locked down civilization because it might have been 3 days if we didn't.
Yeah, it might have been 3 days. Yeah, and so welcome to Septuagesima. It is a very special time of year. It's that time of year again, Septuagesima. That's right.
Yeah, it's already. It's crazy.
So Septuagesima is upon us. So today is St. Valentine's Day, and we have this wonderful calendar from litiatieswithhome.com. Get that for your family. And Septuagesima is pre-Lent. So get ready for Lent. Time to get started and get prepared. Prepare for the preparation. Also, shout out to Trinity Brewing. They just sent me a tin tacker of Blessed Carl. Yeah, so you can check out Trinity Brewing, a new Catholic beer company. We have they're coming on 1 Peter 5 actually this week. We're gonna do beer, a Catholic tradition. That'll be a great.
I've had their beer; it's good.
A great podcast. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes, I've had the Trinity Brewing as well. So
the Fulton Sheen one's my favorite. The red ale, Irish red ale.
I like Our Lady of Mount Carmel.
I didn't have that one. They sent it up to me like it was. I mean, sent beers like sending nuclear plutonium across the border, and it was really good. I really liked the Irish red ale. It was my favorite.
Sweet. So reminder to become a patron of Meaning of Catholic, patreon.com/Meaning of Catholic. You get a 12-part series that we're concluding this week on Jews, Judaism, and Israel. All the controversial topics that YouTube doesn't want you to talk about. That's a 12-part series. You get that as a patron. You get the 5-part series of Christ Against the Occult. You get free books. You get access to the guild chat. So patreon.com/Meaning of Catholic. You can also donate at meaningofcatholic.com. And we're talking about The Terror of Demons book by Kennedy Hall. The newest re-release from Tan is right here. He's got it. My copy is in the mail somewhere. So we're talking today about toxic masculinity, or masculinity not toxic. Masculinity not toxic. What is effeminacy? So tell us about that, Kennedy. I think when you first started the book, you had some comments about toxic masculinity. I think I saw actually, let me start off with this. I think I saw there was a Babylon Bee where it was like husband takes out toxic masculinity, makes his wife change the tire.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
There was some contemptible Canadian politician in Manitoba who it went viral. Like, I don't know what this guy was doing. He was a fool. He put a picture or a short video of his wife shoveling the snow. Manitoba is like, it's like northern Minnesota, but more north. Like, there's a lot of snow and cold up there. Okay. And he's like some labor something or other minister there in the provincial parliament. And he was trying to do this whole, like, my wife is a hero, pro-woman, feminist, hear me roar thing. And she was out shoveling the snow after getting back from a night shift as a nurse. And he's like, this woman never stops. Like, what a hero. And everyone's like, why are you not shoveling the snow? What are you doing? I mean, like, he's not in a wheelchair or something. That'd be one thing. But he's just,
Right.
Anyway. So he was not being taught. He was being good masculinity according to the culture by letting his wife do everything and not doing anything. Okay, so the American psychiatrist, the APA, whatever, if it's psychiatry or psychology, I can't remember. They labeled. They went so far as the last year and a half or so. They actually called masculinity itself toxic. So I mean, there is a attack, I don't know, conspiracy, whatever you want to call it. The war against being a man is real. It is a big deal. And that's sort of from the external perspective, but then from the internal, the war that we wage against ourselves is really a matter of virtue and vice, as it always has been. This is why the ancients have something to say just as much as the guys like, this is why people tune into Joe Rogan today. I mean, for all his faults, he's appealing to that urge for men. They want to do things and be distinctly men, and whatever that means. And it's a very easy question to answer if you read the Bible and you are steeped in traditional thought as much as you can be, as well as obviously in the faith, but in more in the philosophical sense. But we've rejected all that, so our society is sort of floundering, trying to figure out what a man is and so forth. And so masculinity at the end of the day is the perfection of the male. That's what it is. There's certain characteristics, certain temperaments, certain proclivities that men are born with. There are obviously exceptions to the rule, but that's what makes it a rule, as people don't understand. They'll say, well, it's 98 out of 100 young men with boys, when you put a tool in front of them, they like to play with it, and two of them don't. So it's like, well, yeah, that proves the rule. That's how things work. So there are certain characteristics that men have, but the major vice, in my opinion, or the major way of life that basically destroys being a real man, is the vice of effeminacy. And St. Paul actually deals with this, and I have this at the beginning of the chapter. This is chapter 2 in my book. Okay. And not that you have to get this book in order to have a good Lent, but if you did get this book, you would have a better Lent. I'll put it that way.
Get the book. Get the book.
Yeah.
Have a good Lent.
There you go.
There we go.
And so I have a quotes at the beginning of every chapter, and at the beginning of chapter 2, which is called Effeminate Men, I have from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and St. Paul says, know you not that the unjust shall not possess, the kingdom of God. Do not err. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor the effeminate, nor liars with mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor railers, nor extortioners shall possess the kingdom of heaven. So what's interesting there is when I wrote the book and put it out, one of the biggest criticisms from the woke crowd was that when I said effeminacy must be eradicated, that I meant all homosexual men must be killed. That was something people thought. And I'm thinking, well, you've never read the book, because here I have a quote from St. Paul, who distinguishes between liars with mankind, which means, with men, and the effeminate. So it's possible for men of all stripes to be effeminate, of all proclivities, but effeminacy is the key. Effeminacy, as we've talked about many times in the show in the past, it means a reluctance to suffer due to an attachment to pleasure. And basically that just means you're not willing to do hard things in order to do the good thing. And that's how it always manifests itself. And here's a verse from 3 Kings. And it says, he took the effeminate out of the land, and he removed all the filth of the idols which his fathers had made. So effeminacy is clearly not a good thing. God taking the effeminate or allowing the effeminate to be taken out of the land to restore it. So to summarize, masculinity is the perfection of human men, whereas effeminacy is sort of the vice that goes against that thing, because ultimately we see the most excellent example of a man is Jesus Christ. But think for a second about every hero, every masculine hero of every story you've ever read that wasn't some weird, like, woke, strange anti-hero thing. Everyone from knights in shining armor to even modern stories like The Bourne Identity or or Bruce Willis movies or something. It's funny, even if you take a modern Hollywood movie, they can't sell a story about a man who's effeminate and is a hero because no one will buy it. They just can't. Even in today's world, in the woke whatever, they've got to put out a story where Bruce Willis or like Liam Neeson like saves his daughter from terrorists and suffers and wins the day and is virtuous and eschews a harlot or something like that. There's always temptation. He always has to get over it. That's just built into understanding what a man is. And that's where we see the even in today's broken world, we still see that even those woke leftists, they can't help but write something like a real masculine hero into films, and everyone still wants to watch it, and everyone still wants to pay for it. So it's deeply built into us.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the hero, the heroic archetype which is essentially a man who does hard things for the sake of some greater good, greater than himself.
Yeah.
He's doing some kind of hard thing for the country or for saving
Family,
XYZ person.
yeah.
He's risking his life. He's being tough. He can take the punches. That's pretty much it. So basically boiling down that masculine virtue, it's basically fortitude.
Yes.
Strength, perseverance, toughness. Those things right there is in the archetypal masculine hero, even in today's world. I think that's really funny, as you say. They can't even create something. They can't create a woke male and sell him because nobody would want
not as
that.
a hero. Not as a hero.
Not as a hero, at least. Yeah.
You can sell him as like a comedian or something, but he makes fun of himself the whole time.
Yeah.
You can have him as a tragic figure of a show, but it's like some weird artsy HBO thing, and even then, that's not going to have mass appeal. It's like, think about the Super Bowl. I didn't watch it last. I'm not anti. I love football. Like, I mean, as a sport, I mean, it's awesome. I grew up playing it. Culture aside, I'll probably watch the highlights today. I'm excited to see. I saw it was a close game, and that's fun. They're very impressive athletes. But even then, it's funny the juxtaposition of. It's funny to think in a city like LA, which is like the wokest city possible. With this, still have the dumb rules for a lot of COVID stuff, but even all the woke crowd flocks to watch this game, which, again, take the culture, take the professional sporting, silliness away from things and just think about what's actually happening out there. It's one of the most masculine sports you could imagine, in the good sense of the word, in the sense of there's massive camaraderie, there's huge self-sacrifice, you're facing grave danger. It's very cerebral. There's a huge hierarchical aspect. I mean, it's basically like it's like a placeholder for military action football, with everything from the different specializations of the different soldiers on the field and the strategizing of thinking about your opponent. I mean, the intensity that goes into planning for an NFL game it's insane. I mean, you could probably take all those coaches and put them in business, and they'd probably be business tycoons. They just know how to manage people and face obstacles like no one else. And everyone flocks. It's like the biggest event, and it really is like watching Obviously, on the surface, it's just this thing, guys running around with the ball. But when you know the game and you go, these are, I mean, they're like sports Navy SEALs or something like that. That's the way they are. And so anyway, it's remarkable that we just can't kill this thing. And it feels ancient too. Like think of Troy or Hector and Achilles.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what do we see in there? You know, Hector is the hero of that story, even though he loses. And you don't really have any sympathy for Achilles because he's not being honest. He's got a superpower, essentially. And why is Hector having to go to battle? He's having to go to battle because his brother committed essentially adultery,
Mm-hmm.
basically, or facilitated it, you know? And so it's a story about the virtuous man who sacrifices himself against the man who's cheating to make up for the sin of his brother who gave in to his effeminate vice. Like that story is the story of Western civilization. There's a reason why in Christian cultures, Chesterton talks about this in Everlasting Man, men will be named Hector, but they won't be named Achilles.
Mm-hmm. That's true. There's no Achilles. Yeah, that's right.
And he's a loser in the sense of the word. Like he lost, but he's the hero because he did it valiantly. And anyway, this is baked into the cake. So effeminacy goes against this. And I'll just read a quick thing here for people because effeminacy does not mean femininity, as femininity is a perfection like masculinity. Effeminacy is a different word entirely, and its etymology we find in its etymology we find things like softness in the Latin usage. The Greek word for effeminacy in the New Testament is malakia, which means softness. And I already talked about the definition. So think about the men today who are ruining your life. Are they effeminate or are they masculine? Justin Trudeau, Joe Biden, I don't know, Pete Buttigieg. I mean, go on. I mean, who else? They're all the same. They're all a platonic form of effeminacy to me at this point. And that's actually interesting. You mentioned fortitude because Plato tried to theorize to almost like a platonic form of a super virtue, but he couldn't. There still was the 4 cardinal virtues and sort of like the 7 deadly sins that was known by the ancients. But C.S. Lewis said that courage is every virtue at its testing point, which you basically said that ultimately the marker of the man is fortitude, which is courage. So that speaks to what you were saying. But if you think about every villain, and let's go back to these stories, every villain of every story, you can't make a villain you can't make a villain believable as a villain in a story if he doesn't have a vice. Think about that for a moment. Every Bond movie, even though Bond himself has his vices, but even there, when push comes to shove, he'll jump off a cliff for the country, sort of thing.
Yeah, right.
Every villain in the Marvel movie or whatever, pick your story. In crime movies, you know, the gangster villain or so forth. Even think about Batman. Batman is actually a really interesting one because, especially in the new movies, which I thought were pretty decent. Bruce Wayne is actually really virtuous. That's kind of the thing. He's basically a teetotaler. He's a celibate, and he doesn't kill and do sorts of things. He's a philanthropist. He's basically actually quite a virtuous fella, whereas his villains are always very deranged. They're very smart, but that one thing always brings them down. Their vice always destroys them, whether it's their hatred, whether it's their perversion, whether it's their attachment to money or something like that. That's why he can always get them, because Bruce Wayne himself doesn't really have a vice, in a sense, in the natural sense. He's very much a very perfected man. And doesn't have any attachments, whereas his villains always do. Even again, in today's woke Hollywood culture, they will show like a Denzel Washington movie or something. His villains will be running prostitutes or something, and have a vice that way, because it's not believable to people that a good man would be effeminate, and it's not believable to people that a bad man would not have vice, even in our culture. So, effeminacy is at the root of basically all of the problems in our world, in my opinion, because what we have essentially is we have a world where, I mean, good men have not stood up for a really long time. And I'm not talking about uprisings or rebellions. I mean, that's what happens when you haven't been standing up enough. You have to end up doing that, you know? Um, Everyone loves the truckers and things, and I do too. And there's some very good men there. But why did we get to that point? Well, we got to that point because the 400 steps that got us there. Anyway, so before I go on to the roots of effeminacy, did you have anything you wanted to talk about?
Oh yeah, I think it's just really interesting. Like I really don't like James Bond because he the model of James Bond. I haven't seen a Bond movie for like 10 years or something, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like it is this heroic male, but then he commits fornication and he kills some people in vengeance because he feels like it. But like you said, when push comes to shove, like at the climax of the movie where he's about to sacrifice his life to save the country and the world, if he were to turn around and say, "Oh no, I'm going to go with the Bond girl or whatever, or go drink my martini or whatever, because I'm going to choose pleasure over duty," then everybody would forsake James Bond. It'd be this guy's terrible. Like he didn't do his duty. Like everybody expects him to ultimately do his duty in the end, even though he's going to be a little bit slimy on the way there because they create this little image of him. So I think what you're saying is so spot on that the world wants masculine men to actually do their duty, to do the hard thing for the sake of others. And so if all the men were doing their duty, I think there would be a great good for families and society. And there's also a sort of a masculine shame attached to that, where men would pressure each other to do their duty because men would be embarrassed to not do their duty. That would be embarrassing. That would be unmanly. But there's been ways that they've been able to, like, speaking of the Super Bowl again, hip hop stars, for example, like rock stars and those type of celebrities are very effeminate. They don't, all they do is rap about the fact that they have money or whatever. And they're just very effeminate figures. And the whole culture of popular music is trying to create this attachments to all sorts of vices or whatever, and even the music itself. And so they're not only that, but there are all these other things to get attached to, both unlawful things that we could talk about, but there's also just lawful things like television is not in itself sinful, but it can be attachment. Food, what attachment? I mean, here's a great Lenten topic to understand and fight against. Here is so many different methods of becoming attached to pleasures, so to becoming effeminate.
Yeah, and it's funny, back to the Bond thing. He always has to sacrifice the vice because we see it as the female love interest in the show, but it's an unlawful love interest because it's out of wedlock and that sort of thing. You would not believe he was a good man if he sacrificed his wife. If you think about it, if you watch the movie, but because it is someone he's having a dalliance with, we understand that has to be secondary because you have to let the vice go.
Yeah, secondary to the mission, right?
That's right.
True.
Right. And this is why, everyone knows my political leanings. I'm whatever, but I still advocate for hierarchy and order in all of our lives, and it's necessary. Again, back to sports, this is why those things fill such a void. Now, they can become an idol and things like that in our society. But this necessity to have what you mentioned about having this sort of healthy shame from other males in your life, these structures that have been put into place over time, and they can change, obviously, but the root is very similar. Football teams are not new, or sorry, are not old in the historical sense. I mean, they're 150 years old or something. But there's always been things like that going on when groups of males would get together. And the nice thing about those structures is that it facilitates a very organic, let's call it healthy shame, because the results are seen in your performance. I remember one thing that got me when I was in I was 22. It was in my senior year, and I was playing university. And there was a young kid who was like 18 or 19, and he was a superstar. He went on to I think he might have played in the CFL. Anyway, he was a linebacker. I was a fullback. So we were always against each other in these drills, and he would beat me like 5 out of 10 times. And one day I just was I had to beat him, just whatever. And I barely did. And again, he was 3 or 4 years younger than me. It was not impressive that I was able to white knuckle it and finally beat him in a drill because he was much younger than me. And he said, "Kenny, did you not like me?" I said, "No, man, I just had to beat you because you beat me so many times, And he kind of got it because I felt embarrassed. That's some of the things he did to me in drills, like his quickness and his first step and things. And I get popped, and I was like, "My goodness gracious, this kid is schooling me." And no one said anything about it, but it was just known. It was, yeah, you got beat. And then you couldn't run and hide because I had to go into the drill again, And anyway, that's built into the thing. So the roots of effeminacy. Okay, this is part of chapter 2. And if you haven't read the book, I tried to make it as useful and practical as possible. I tried to make it something where you could easily open up a chapter and you say, "What was that thing? What was that thing?" And you flip 2 pages and you find it. So it's not like some academic tome where it's going to take you go to the index or something. It's pretty simple. So I talk about the roots of effeminacy. There's actually a quote here from Father Ripperger. And I took a lot of quotes from his talk, How to Raise a Man, which is a great talk. And he says, "The real man is the man of virtue. With virtue comes interior self-discipline and self-control. It is a hallmark of a real man. He can engage in things that are hard and arduous and still remain steadfast. A man who wilts is effeminate." This is what we've been talking about. This is me speaking here. As with all sinfulness, we find ourselves looking to the fall. When sin entered the world through the actions of Adam and Eve, St. Thomas, along with other saints and theologians, states that the original sin is pride. This should give us pause when we see pride as something worthy of a parade. Could there be anything more offensive to God than celebrate the most fundamental of sins with a display that glorifies sexual deviancy? At any rate, the original sin is pride, which is the primary sin of Adam and Eve. Pride is traditionally defined as a desire to exalt oneself beyond what is appropriate for one's state or condition. This is demonstrated in the 3rd chapter of Genesis as the serpent tempts Eve. The devil says, "For God doth know that in what day soever you shall eat thereof, your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." Eve is attracted to the possibility of seeking equality with God, which is the sin that cast Lucifer out of heaven in the first place. So the first sin, the fathers and scholastics and theologians and so forth, they tell us is pride, which is pretty simple. But it's not. But, you tell that to the average person and they'll say, "Why is it pride?" And it's because of that definition of pride is to exalt yourself to a position you're not supposed to be in. Pride is not the same thing as arrogance. Pride is not the same thing as being cocky. It's not the same thing as being high on yourself. Pride is believing that you ought to have a position that you're not supposed to have. This is why Lucifer says, I'm not going to do what you want, God, because I'm equal with you, essentially. So inherent in that first sin is the sin of pride, but what's also inherent in it is the sin of lust. I never knew this until I was researching, 3 or 4 years ago for this book, but I never thought of this, but what we see in this narrative, in this story of Adam and Eve, which I believe to be true, but let's just take it at face value for sort of a metaphorical or allegorical purpose. What we see is there is something that is pleasing to the eyes because it talks about the fruit looking good to eat. Okay, and biblical shorthand, there's more to it than just, it looks nice. It's also something that's going to provide some sort of sensation. Fruits are delicious, So it's something attractive that you're not supposed to go after. That's lust. That's essentially what that sin is. But at the root of all these sins, if there could be a platonic form of sin, it would be something like pride. Because ultimately, even if you say it implicitly to yourself, you say to yourself, I'm not supposed to be a sinner because that's not why I'm here, but I'll do it anyway. And I'll put myself into a position where I basically am above the moral law. It's a sin of pride. So that is the root of the original sin. And from there, if you think about how Adam reacted, what did he do? He didn't stop Eve from doing it. Now, obviously, she had free will, and no one's suggesting that. I don't know. What would the theologians say? You should have restrained her. I have no idea. But if you think about what goes on in that moment when Eve is dialoguing with the devil, even there, that's a prideful activity, because why would you think you could talk to somebody with like the highest evangelical intelligence? Why is Adam not there saying, this is enough, I'll step in? This is, and it's not to say that Adam wouldn't have been physically impressive. He probably was. I mean, he was without corruption of the body. He was probably like Michelangelo's David, for goodness sake. But it was this ability, this willingness to acquiesce to an interior disposition that manifests itself in an exterior activity that was effeminate. And ultimately, what ends up happening is it destroys the male-female order, which we'll talk about. Did you have anything you want to add?
Yeah. Yeah. So Adam is effeminate because he and Eve exalt themselves above the moral law.
Yeah.
I think this brings up an important part about effeminacy, and that is the relationship of the man to his woman. Because sometimes a man must do his duty, and in the moment, his woman might not like that for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
It might cause a argument, perhaps. And many men want to keep peace in their household rather than doing something that may spark some friction, but it's the right thing to do. So this is an example of effeminacy, because you're addicted to the pleasure of peace, of the absence of conflict. But that's not actual peace, because peace is actual justice. It's basically the absence of conflict. You want that more than you want your particular duty, to do your duty as a man. So Adam didn't do his duty to protect his wife Eve against the serpent, because he was effeminate. He wanted to keep an absence of conflict with his woman rather than start a conflict.
Well, and it destroys the male-female order, because we see this many places in the Bible, but it's baked into the natural law as well, where there's this submission, right? And again, this is one of those things that'll get you canceled. Even priests, when this comes up in the Novus Ordo calendar, they'll take. You can actually take the short reading. You don't have to read the whole thing if you don't want to, about women submit to your husbands. But this is. It's only, there's no such thing as two people being in charge at the same time and making the tough decision. Like, you can't do it.
Right.
Even if you do something like that, you have to delegate to somebody. But the person who's saying to be delegating is de facto in charge, because they've delegated it. Men and wife are called to submit to one another, in the sense of a mutual submission for, submitting to submitting to one another as a cross. Not that your wife is a cross, your husband is a cross here on Valentine's Day, in the sense of, they're torturous to you, I hope. But we do sanctify each other. In a sense, I submit to the desires of my children, or their needs, at least. Not the desire. I shouldn't submit to their petty desires, but I do submit to them. Goodness gracious, how many times a day do you submit to your kids, what they need? And that's fine. That's service, right? That's baked into the cake. That is something that St. Paul says, because he does say being subject to one another in the fear of Christ. But then he goes right on to say, let women be subject to their husbands as to the Lord, because the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church and delivered himself up for it, that he might sanctify it, cleansing it by the laver of water, the word of life, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy, without blemish. So I always say to people, it's like, they get upset about the whole submit to your husband's thing. It's like, well, read what he means by that. What he means is you're supposed to act like Jesus Christ. And what are you supposed to act? We know what Jesus Christ did. He died. He went to the cross and all those sorts of things. He took the sins of the world. That would include the sins of your wife. And you know what I mean? Like if you think about it that way. And also we know Christ is the new Adam and compared to Adam, who's the old Adam. And if Christ is having to sort of right the ship and fix the sin that was there, then taking on of the sacrificing and being the head of the human race is showing that Adam failed in his head of the human race because of this effeminacy, this reluctance to suffer due to an attachment to pleasure. The tree was pleasurable, the fruit was pleasurable, no conflict with the wife was pleasurable, and to get in the way of that would have caused suffering, and that's essentially what was missed there. And we see when we continue this explanation of the fall. It's the prime example of marital confusion. It has a usurpation of leadership by Eve and a neglect of duty and service by Adam. You have to think of that moment. I mean, people will say, was he a snake? Was he a serpent? Was he a dragon? Whatever. However the devil manifests himself, I would imagine it would have been pretty striking. It wouldn't have been like, oh, Eve's just sort of sitting beside a garter snake on the ground and whispering to herself. I mean, it probably would. The word that's used in Hebrew, Scott Hahn, he's pretty good with that stuff. And he actually said it was this word nahash, which is, I think, used in Revelation. So it's more like a serpentine predator, almost like a dragon. But we manifest it as a snake in most of our art. So that's how we see it. In any case, Adam was right there with her at the time as well. We know that because it says immediately as she took the fruit, she shared with him. So how do you share fruit with somebody? You take it and you pass it to them. You can't pass it unless they're right there. Also, there was, nobody else in the garden. So like there's another party going on somewhere else. And so Adam was witnessing this thing happen. So there's multiple levels of a disordered relationship happening here. For one, the wife is dealing with the intruder while the husband watches. Secondly, the wife is basically saying we should do this sin. And the husband says, okay. And third, immediately after, what do we see? We see that Adam himself flees danger, but then he also flees responsibility. Because what happens after this? God comes into the garden. And even there is a great talk somewhere. I think I do have it bookmarked on something anyway, about maybe I don't here somewhere else. But there is Scott Hahn does a great talk on that. And him being a biblical guy, he goes into the words and things. And he talks about the word footsteps that's used when God's walking in the garden. And apparently it's more like if you were to hear like in those Jurassic Park movies with like the stomping, it's more like that. It's like the sound of helicopters, So this God coming into the garden, it was a very noticeable thing. It was a very imposing thing. And what does he say? Well, he asks Adam, where are you? And Adam immediately blames his wife. He doesn't just say, I'm over here, God. I didn't do it. He goes, no, it's not my fault. It's her fault.
Right. Now we have a model for marital disintegration. Blame your spouse for the problems in the relationship.
Yeah.
I think this is great. And one of the things that you mentioned that's important is that the man, because to be a man, one must have that fortitude, but there's also an aspect of initiative where, yeah, you're the head of the family. That means you're the one who faces the intruder. You're the head of the family. That means you're the one who goes and takes the bullet for the family. That's what it means to be the head of the family. Like you just said, you're the one who initiates the love and care as the man. You take care of your wife and children, and then she submits to you. It's sort of like you initiate that, and that's an important piece, because men want to read these scriptures and they say, well, now woman, submit to your husband, submit to me, and they're kind of like, they want to take a shortcut, and that's kind of effeminate right there, because you want to basically you want to be the head of the household without any cost to yourself, and that's not manly. So you got to start off with the love and care and protection. Suzanne is asking, what is the duty of a man to his family? Also, what does he choose when in conflict between his duty towards his family and that of his profession? If you go to, I just want to point this out real quick because it's a little resource. If you go to meaningofcatholic.com, there's resources, and you scroll down here to miscellaneous, summary of Catholic doctrine with links to the Summa. And you click on this, and the very first thing is duties of your state in life. And so there is a mutual submission, first of all, in marriage, because there are mutual duties that spouses render to each other. So that's where the mutual submission comes in. But husband is the head and protector of his family. He has the duty to provide enough for his wife to stay home and the children to have proper care. He has the duty to administer his family property wisely. Head and protector of his family to guide his wife and children. So basically his family comes first, but there's a sense in which your profession actually is part of your duties to your family. So it would seem that in a conflict situation between your profession and your family, you should choose your profession if and only if your profession actually is directly tied in with doing your duties for your family. Otherwise, you wouldn't choose your profession, I would see. But what are your thoughts on that, Kennedy? Any thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is where the virtue of prudence comes in. So what does he choose when in conflict between his duty towards his family and his profession? Well, it would depend on the severity of that thing, like of hoping that you have communication with your spouse. There's so many layers here that you'd have to peel back. I don't know the person's. This is probably a hypothetical thing, but
depends on the situation. Certainly.
Let's just say someone calls in and says, we're on like one of those helplines. My husband works too much, whatever. It's like, well, first of all, you're going to have to peel back these layers of how did you get here? Have you been communicating? Blah, blah, blah. But, let's just say you have decent communication and your husband's been a bit of workaholic, which I've been guilty of before, especially when you're trying to get all these projects done. Well, the primary duty that you have, I would argue, to your family in this fallen world, because no one's going to give them the sustenance except for you. If you have to work 70 hours a week and your financial situation, let's say, is at the position where you're basically dependent on that because you're all overextended and things like that, well, you can't just pull the plug that day and say, to heck with it, I'm not going into work tomorrow. And it's like, well, you're not going to get paid, and then we're not going to pay our mortgage. And that's a real problem. Okay. So you can't let your family be out on the street. But once you've identified the issue, then you're going to have to say, okay, how do we peel this back and how do I put my family first? Okay. So it's not a simple thing of, just quit your job tomorrow and be with your family. You're going to have to obviously balance all the things. And that's going to be part of making up for the disorder. Like this is every time in our lives that we do something sinful or unvirtuous or vicious, as you would say, the hardest part is not stopping the thing. The hardest part is righting the ship. It's easy to, the solution to working too much is very simple in a sense. It's just don't work, but you can't just not work because, you have to pay your bills and things like that. So that's going to take some strategy there. But I will say, let's just say a wife does go to her husband and there is this. Well, the first step towards taking leadership would be the husband saying, I have done this and I have worked too much. My job is taking me away from you. Now I've acknowledged this. Now here's my plan to do it. And, that itself would be a win because it changes your perspective on things. I mean, this is, for example, to throw to go much in a tangent here, but, some of the people that work the most are farmers. When you ask a farmer, it's like, how many hours a week do you spend doing things that have to do with your farm? No less than 60 hours a week. Always. Now, that sounds crazy when you think of your 60-hour-a-week work-a-day job. But for some reason, for the farm life, it doesn't translate to being a quote-unquote workaholic because it's built into the fabric of the thing that it meshes with family rhythms. It's built into the fabric of it. It's also you're at home, so it could be 3 hours before 8 o'clock rolls around, okay? And a couple hours after the kids are, those things. So obviously it's not like you're gone 10 hours, 11 hours in a row every day. But the mentality there, if your husband was working 60 hours a week and was commuting, you'd think he was never home. Anyway, but the point is that the perspective of how the thing is taking place and putting the family rhythms first, it actually makes the sacrifice seem like it's less. So even there, let's just say he was working too much. I would say, well, first thing is there a way to reorient the schedule? Is there a way to appease your family duties and say, okay, I'm going to change this, this, and this? That puts in these priorities. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, I don't miss dad as much because he's here at these important times. Does that make sense? So part of it's going to be the communication, the perspective.
Yeah, good one. We got about 5 minutes left. What else you want to touch on, Kennedy?
So the last thing I want to touch on, this whole idea of blaming. This is the last part of the chapter. I have sort of my final paragraph here. Your Adam, your home is your garden. Everything is your responsibility, and all failures will be worked out on your shoulders. The goal for men is to go from being the old Adam to the new Adam. As a punishment, but also as a penance, the Lord said to Adam, because thou hast hearkened to the voice of thy wife, cursed is the earth in thy work. With labor and toil shalt thou eat thereof all the days of thy life. Furthermore, Adam's work will be among thorns and thistles, and in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. This is a prefigurement of the new Adam, Jesus Christ, and his work to reverse the original sin. Christ does this with an act of humility so great that he allows himself to be mocked with the crown of thorns. Also, the passion begins with the agony in the garden, the sweating of blood from the great weight of sin. Among thorns, our Lord works out our salvation by the bloody sweat of his brow. So, if we are to transition from the old Adam to the new, we must work tirelessly all the days of our life. In order to, let's say, go down this path of virtue, one of the things you find with men who are virtuous in any aspect of their life. Again, they could be a coach, they could be a businessman, they could be whatever, something. They're always tired. And I know this is like you as well. I was talking to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's like, I don't know how Tim does all this stuff. And you one time said to him after church, you said, so much coffee. Like if you are trying to do all of these things, you're going to be tired all the time in some way. And I don't mean you should feel run down. But if ever a day goes by, and obviously Sunday is a day of rest and that sort of thing, and we should obviously have time for leisure, of course. But if ever a day goes by where you think, wow, I could have done so much more today, I did nothing, it's probably a bad day. Even proper leisure will take energy. Like proper leisure involves, like taking my kids skating. Oh my goodness. It's like, I feel like I'm the Israelites walking across the desert. It's unbelievable. Like, I can't believe how difficult it is to get the kids out of the car, trudge across the snow to the rink, because we can't. Hopefully, actually, soon the passports will be done. We can take it with the ring. That's much easier. But it's like I'm out there and I'm tying their laces with my fingers are frozen, and I got to put my skates on, and the toddler's running off to the playground. But like taking them to have leisure is like the hardest thing I've ever done. Every time I do it, think about going to the beach. You know, we love to go to the beach in the summer, and it's like you got to park and you got to walk. I'm dragging stuff across like a mule. You know, the best days of our lives, I have to exert the most energy. And that makes sense though, because if you're going to put in the energy, you're going to have a result. So when when in this book, one of the criticisms I've had is that, well, this all seems like it's too much. It is too much. That's the point. We fell from grace, and it's too much for us to do it all on our own. So we have to do as much as we possibly can, which will exhaust us. And then we have to rely on the sacraments. We have to rely on prayer. So I do mention the rosary a little bit in that chapter, how the rosary fights against effeminacy. And I'll just finish here. I think, in my opinion, I'd never read this anywhere. This is just my personal opinion. When Christ whips out the money changers, liberation theologist, it's not because he's against capitalism or something. It's not against money. But there's an economy of sin being sold in the temple at that point, and also they're sitting in the court of the Gentiles, which means they're actually stopping salvation of those outside of the Jewish people. There's a whole reason for that. But what does he do? He actually sees the problem, and then it says he made a knotted cord, essentially. So he went somewhere else. He got some materials, and he made this cord with all these little beads and knots in it, something like a rosary. And then he went in and he whipped everybody, and he got the scourge of the economy of sin out of the holy place. That's the message we can take from there. I don't know how long it took Christ to make that scourge of knotted cords. I have no idea. Let's just say it took 20 minutes. I don't know. How long does it take to pray the rosary? About 16 minutes? 12 if you're praying by yourself and you're whispering. The rosary is this thing right here. The rosary is, and these rugged rosaries are actually probably a weapon because they're made of metal, but the rosary is that scourge of knotted cords. And when we face a challenge, we take time to leave for 15 or 20 minutes, and we go and we run our fingers over those knots in this cord, and then that thing is the scourge that rids the economy of sin from our lives in that moment. And that is, if I could, you will learn 1,000 times more praying the rosary every day on your knees than you will reading my book, although you should still buy my book.
Well, but I think that's a great way to put this. It is more than you can handle. That's the point, because we are called to do more than we can handle. We're called to do more by grace. One thing that you have done here is we've emphasized virtue as against the vice of effeminacy.
Mm-hmm.
Notice that we never talked about a particular temperament or personality of man, because that's another trap, because you can have there's different personalities of men, but they can all be masculine. It's not your particular personality or that type of thing. It's really the difference between vice and virtue. And there's also a way that I think that, like, women have bought your book because they want to whip their men into shape. And there's sort of a way in which women can spark that masculine energy in men to really become the head of the house, to really sacrifice. And they can do so. They can kind of speak to their man in a way that only women can.
Mm-hmm.
And this can be a very positive thing. So the point is, becoming masculine can also be something that you work through with your woman, with your spouse. you need to take care of yourself, take care of your own business, your own responsibility, but working and communicating with your spouse. So,
yep. Many women have bought the book, and I know couples that actually keep it, and then when things get hard in life, they actually read chapters of it together, and they read, okay, what are we doing here? Why are we being attacked, and so on and so forth. So,
nice.
Yeah, for spouses, for sure.
Fantastic. All right, well, let's. It's all the time we have, so make sure to buy the book for Lent. Overcome Effeminacy for Lent. It's a great thing to do for all men. We need to do this to become men. Overcome effeminacy. So let's offer up an Our Father, meditating on the masculinity of Jesus Christ, who destroyed effeminacy. He suffered to do his Father's will. So we also must suffer to do our own Father's will. Let's pray. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster, qui es in caeli, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitti nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Jesus is King.